Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now let's get started. I remember that evening in Seattle so clearly, even though it feels like a blur of unease now. The date was set for a quiet seafood restaurant by the docks. The kind of place where the smell of salt water mixes with fried fish and the faint tang of vinegar from the tartar sauce. I arrived early, just before 7, and the rain was steady against the windows, making the city lights blur in long streaks across the glass. The restaurant itself was small, cozy, with low ceilings and wooden beams darkened by age. Only a few tables were occupied, mostly couples quietly eating, some people reading alone with a cup of coffee, a faint smell of clam chowder lingering in the air. He arrived shortly after, apologizing for the slight delay, smiling in a way that made it feel like nothing in the world could go wrong. The first hour was ordinary, even pleasant. We ordered oysters to start, then salmon for him and halibut for me. Our plates arrived quickly, the food warm and carefully arranged, the lights of the restaurant reflecting off the polished wood of the table. Rain kept tapping against the windows in a soft, rhythmic way that somehow made everything feel calm. Then, just as I was reaching for the water glass, he excused himself. He said he needed to take a call. I watched him go, disappearing through the small archway near the kitchen, and then the feeling shifted. At first, it was subtle. The lights seemed to dim, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the edges of the room felt more shadowed. The staff, who had been cheerful and attentive, now seemed to move around us quietly, their eyes avoiding ours as they carried plates past. Something in the way they glanced at me, quickly and then away, made my stomach tighten. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just me imagining things, I told myself. The rain had grown heavier, drumming against the windows with a louder insistence. I watched the water slip down the glass in long, crooked trails, and then I noticed the empty corners of the restaurant. They seemed darker, more pronounced. The other tables looked like islands in the dim light, the people at them almost frozen in place, as if they were waiting for something I couldn't see. I excused myself to the restroom, hoping the motion would clear my head. The narrow corridor leading to it was colder than the rest of the restaurant, the tiles slick with moisture from the rain tracked in on shoes. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, and I thought I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. I shook my head and pushed it aside. When I returned to the table, he was gone. The chair on his side was empty, and the plate he had been eating from was still there, half untouched. My first thought was that he had stepped outside, but there was no trace of him. Then I noticed something else. Every other person in the restaurant was staring at me. Not a glance or two, but a solid, unbroken wave of eyes. Their expressions weren't just curious, they were sharp, calculating, like I had done something wrong. I realized then that my jacket was missing from the back of my chair. The leather one, the one I always kept with me, wasn't there. Panic started to creep in. I walked slowly toward the front, keeping my hands visible, pretending to understand nothing. The host at the podium looked down, pretending to adjust something, and the waiters moved past me, as if I wasn't there. The rain outside was louder now, slapping against the windows with a kind of violence that matched the beat of my heart. I pushed the door open, and the smell of wet wood and brine hit me immediately. The docks were empty. Fog had rolled in thick from the water, curling around the posts and stretching along the edges of the piers. Then I saw it, a rowboat, tethered loosely to the dock, rocking gently in the water. My jacket was in it, neatly folded at the bottom. I stepped closer, my feet splashing in the puddles forming on the wooden planks, and for a moment, I thought maybe someone had left it there as a joke. I reached for it and froze. There was no one around, and yet something felt deliberately placed. The jacket wasn't just abandoned, it was staged. I looked out over the water. The fog was thick enough that I could see only a few meters ahead. The city lights reflected off the slick surface of the water, broken into streaks by the rain. The sound of the boat moving in the small waves was steady, almost hypnotic. I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing the leather. Then I noticed footprints in the wet wood, small and fast, leading from the end of the dock toward the boat, but none leading away from it. I stepped back instinctively. The logic of the scene didn't make sense. If someone had put the jacket there, where were they now? And where had he gone? I scanned the docks, the fog swallowing everything beyond a few meters, and then I saw something else. A faint smear of red on one of the planks near the edge, just enough to make my stomach turn. Not enough to scream danger, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand on end. I backed away from the water and toward the street lights. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no one around, no cars, no pedestrians, nothing but the dull hum of the city in the distance. The restaurant itself was quiet now, the warm glow from inside looking almost like it belonged to another world, one I had somehow been pushed out of. I wrapped the jacket around myself, feeling the damp leather cold against my skin, and started walking. I didn't stop until I was a few blocks away. The city felt normal again, the rain falling without malice, the streets dotted with people hurrying past umbrellas. I kept thinking about him, about the way he had just vanished, about the quiet, deliberate way the restaurant staff had ignored me. Something had been planned, orchestrated, and I hadn't seen it until it was too late. I reported it later, of course. The restaurant claimed no knowledge. The staff were polite but evasive. The police checked the docks and the rowboat. My jacket was there when I showed them, but there was no sign of him, no fingerprints, no clues. Surveillance footage had gaps, conveniently, and every time I tried to recreate the night in my mind, details felt slightly off, like a dream I was only half awake in. Weeks passed. Life moved on, but I never went back to the waterfront. I started avoiding seafood restaurants near the water, even places I had loved before. The city felt the same, but the docks never looked normal again. I still think about that evening whenever the rain starts to fall heavily, and I remember the way the fog rolled in and the way the boat rocked gently with my jacket inside it. I never found him. I never learned why it happened, but I did learn to trust my instincts in a way I never had before. And sometimes when I walk past a quiet restaurant near the water, I pause just for a moment, and I make sure the lights are on, the staff are busy, and the chairs are where they should be. Because that night, I realized how quickly the ordinary can turn into something completely unexplainable, and how careful you have to be with the people you think you know. Even now, I keep a spare set of keys, a phone fully charged, and I never leave a coat unattended. The city is still the same, the rain still falls, but I walk a little faster, and I watch the shadows a little closer. That night taught me that not all disappearances are obvious, and not every quiet evening ends the way you expect. Some evenings end with a rowboat rocking in the fog and a jacket left behind, a reminder that reality can bend quietly and leave you completely alone to make sense of it. It's been months, and I'm still careful when I go out. I've learned the streets, the docks, the places where fog gathers. I walk with my head up, always checking, always aware. And though I can't explain what happened that night, I can control what I do next. I can't bring him back, but I can survive, and I can make sure I never end up standing alone in the rain with nothing but a jacket in a boat to mark what's left of someone I trusted. It doesn't make the memory any less vivid, but it makes me cautious. And in a city like Seattle, with the rain and the docks and the fog, being cautious is the only way to stay safe. I agreed to meet him at a small jazz bar in the city around 11:30 p.m. The bar was dimly lit, smoke curling lazily from a few lingering cigarettes, the soft hum of a bass filling the background while a saxophone whispered through the corners of the room. I had only met him a few times before, just casual drinks and light conversation, but something about the way he smiled that night made me think it would be okay to go with him after. He said he wanted to show me his record collection, and I figured, why not? It seemed harmless. He drove a black car, old but well-maintained, with leather seats that smelled faintly of smoke and something else I couldn't place. We left the bar, and I noticed immediately that the streets weren't the ones I was familiar with. They were narrower, industrial, lined with warehouses that looked long abandoned, their windows dark and empty. I assumed it was just a shortcut. I tried to make small talk, joking about how we seemed to have entered a different city, but he didn't respond. He didn't glance at me, didn't react in any way. He kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, his eyes locked straight ahead. The silence started to feel heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to pull out my phone to call a friend, just to let someone know where I was, but my hand hit the floor. It had slipped from my lap during a turn, and when I bent down to grab it, I saw the screen was shattered, spiderweb cracks radiating from the corner. My heart jumped. I picked it up, hoping it would still work, but the screen was dead. No signal, no light, nothing. I tried again, pressing buttons frantically, but it stayed black. I swallowed hard and looked up at him. He hadn't even noticed. He just kept driving, the car moving deeper into streets that felt less and less like anywhere I knew. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe he knew a shortcut. Maybe I was overthinking. But then the streets became tighter, the streetlights sparse, flickering in a rhythm that made my stomach churn. Every few seconds, the shadows from the empty buildings stretched across the road, long and jagged, twisting like they had a life of their own. My fingers dug into the edge of the seat. I considered asking him where we were going again, but the way he kept his eyes on the road made me hesitate. There was a calmness in him that was too rigid, almost mechanical, and that made me more nervous than the streets themselves. The city faded behind us, replaced by an industrial zone I had only ever seen in pictures. Factories loomed in the darkness, metal skeletons of their daytime selves. Piles of debris and rusted machinery lined the sides of the road. The smell changed too, something like oil and burnt plastic, acrid and heavy in the air. I realized I had no idea where I was or how to get back. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. And then, almost out of nowhere, we were there. A massive warehouse loomed ahead, its doors closed, the only light coming from a dim bulb hanging above the entrance. It wasn't welcoming. The area around it was completely empty. I noticed now that there wasn't a single other car on the streets we had driven, not even the faint sound of traffic in the distance. It was as if the world had stopped. He parked and turned off the engine. I tried to open the door and leave, but he leaned over and whispered something about listening to records, and I froze. My mind was racing, but I wasn't sure why I felt paralyzed. We stepped out, and I realized how massive the warehouse was. Inside, it smelled of dust and damp concrete. There were crates stacked high, some leaning precariously, the shadows they cast stretching across the floor in long, dark lines. He asked me if I could see the shadows moving behind the crates. I didn't understand what he meant. My eyes scanned the space, every corner filled with darkness. I wanted to move, wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the floor. I told myself to stay calm. He had mentioned records. Maybe he really did just collect them. I tried to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the shadows were just illusions in the poor light. But there was something wrong with the way he was looking at me. Calm, precise, controlled, but not kind. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I thought about my phone again. Shattered, useless, lying in the car. There was no way to call anyone. Panic started to rise, a tight knot in my chest that made breathing difficult. I scanned the warehouse for exits. There was the door we came in, and at the far end, another set of large metal doors, probably used for deliveries. The place was massive. I had no idea if anyone else was around, or if it even mattered. I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't rely on him, and I couldn't wait for him to make the next move. I started walking slowly toward the far doors, keeping my movements casual. I told myself to stay calm, to keep a neutral expression. I couldn't let him know I was scared, not fully. Every shadow seemed to move just slightly when I looked away, every sound amplified in the empty warehouse. My shoes scraped against the concrete floor, small echoes that felt enormous. Then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light from under one of the side doors, a narrow exit at the edge of the building. I crept toward it, careful not to make noise. My pulse was racing, each step a battle against my panic. I could feel his presence behind me, just a few feet away, and I focused all my energy on the exit. When I reached it, the door was unlocked. I pushed slowly, just enough to slip through, and the cold night air hit me immediately. I sprinted without looking back, the sound of my shoes slapping against the empty streets filling the silence. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew I needed to get to a place with people. I ran toward the faint glow of distant streetlights, the smell of the city growing stronger with every step. Eventually, I found a main road. Cars passed by, and I waved frantically at the first one that slowed. A man stopped and let me in, and I could finally breathe again. I explained quickly where I had come from, my voice shaking, and he called the police while I sat in the passenger seat, still trembling. The warehouse was investigated later, and it turned out to be abandoned, no records, no reason for him to bring anyone there. He was arrested a few days later. I never saw him again, and the city felt different after that night. The jazz bar felt safe again, but I never went alone. I kept my phone close, charged, and always had a plan to leave just in case. That night stayed with me for a long time, the feeling of being trapped, of being completely powerless. But I also learned something crucial. I could think clearly under pressure, I could act even when terrified, and I could survive something that felt like it had no solution. The relief I felt that night when I got back to real streets, to real people, was overwhelming, a reminder that even in the darkest, most empty places, there was a way out if I kept my head and kept moving. I never forgot the way the warehouse smelled, the way the shadows seemed alive, or the feeling of my phone shattering and cutting me off from the world. But I also never forgot the moment I realized I could get myself out, and that realization made me feel stronger than I had before. I knew that fear could never trap me as long as I trusted my instincts. And that night, as I sat safe in a real car again, driving back toward the city lights, I understood clearly that being alert, careful, and willing to act was the only real safety I could ever rely on. I never went back to his records, never looked for him, and never doubted my own judgment again. The city at night could be cruel and empty, but I had learned to navigate it, and that knowledge became my shield, sharper than any locks or doors could ever be. It was one of those late winter evenings in Brooklyn, when the streets feel colder than the air actually is, and the dim streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalks. I had stopped into a tiny coffee shop on a side street, the kind of place you almost miss if you don't pay attention. The smell of strong espresso and baked pastries hit me the moment I walked in, warm and familiar against the chill outside. The place was nearly empty, except for one man sitting at a corner table, his coat draped over the chair next to him. He looked normal, maybe a little too cheerful, laughing loudly at something I couldn't hear, tapping on his laptop in an almost exaggerated way, as if he wanted anyone who walked in to notice him. I ordered my coffee and found a small table near the window, hoping for a quiet moment before heading home. He glanced over at me, smiling, and for some reason, I felt a tiny pang of unease. But I shrugged it off. People smiled at strangers all the time. That's New York. Minutes later, he was walking toward my table. He introduced himself with an easy grin, and I felt my shoulders relax. He was chatty, asking about the coffee shop, commenting on the cold, talking about Brooklyn in a way that sounded almost rehearsed. At first, I enjoyed the conversation because I had been alone all day, but there was something about him, something just under the surface, that didn't sit right with me. He laughed too loudly, gesturing with his hands in a way that seemed exaggerated. His eyes, though, were sharp, constantly scanning, flitting to the door, to the other patrons, to the street outside. It made me nervous, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Eventually, I mentioned I needed to leave to catch the subway. I thought the conversation was over, that I could finally get some space. But instead, he insisted on walking with me. At first, I hesitated. I didn't know this man beyond the small talk in a coffee shop. But something in his tone, a kind of polite insistence, a pressure that was almost invisible, made it hard to refuse. I found myself walking beside him as we left the shop, the cold biting at my cheeks, the streets quieter than usual for that time of night. The walk started out uneventful. He kept talking, still too loudly, asking questions I didn't always answer, and making comments that didn't need a response. But as we turned the corner toward the 14th Street station, something changed. He went quiet. His eyes flicked from person to person, lingering on anyone who looked like they were alone. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. The energy around him shifted, like he was no longer the same person I had met in the coffee shop. He seemed cautious, maybe even tense. My stomach sank. We descended into the station, the smell of hot metal and dust hitting me. The platform was nearly empty, just a few late commuters scattered along the edge. He stopped near the train tracks, and I realized he was watching me more closely than ever. The usual chatter and echoes of the subway seemed to fade, leaving a heavy silence around us. When the train arrived, it screeched into the station, lights flashing and doors sliding open. He leaned in close and whispered something I didn't fully understand at first. The words hit me like a cold punch. Get off at the next stop alone. I froze. The train doors began to close, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind was racing, but my body refused to respond. I realized he had no intention of coming with me. My sense of safety, which had been fragile at best, collapsed entirely. I got on the train, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the pole. The carriage smelled like old sweat and subway grime. I gripped the metal pole as the train lurched forward, heart hammering, my eyes darting to the empty spaces around me. I couldn't believe this was happening. My phone, which had been my lifeline, was dead. No battery, no directions, no way to call anyone. The thought of being completely alone in a city, I thought I knew, made my chest tighten. By the time the train screeched into the next stop, my mind was in a fog of panic. I stepped off, glancing back down the platform, half expecting to see him following, but he was nowhere in sight. He had vanished as if he had never existed. My legs felt like lead, and the fluorescent lights of the station flickered overhead. I didn't know this area at all. The streets outside were almost deserted, the kind of quiet that made every creak of a garbage can lid sound like a scream. I started walking, trying to remember landmarks, any sign that could lead me back. I walked past shuttered shops and darkened brownstones, past empty streets that all looked the same in the dim streetlights. Every shadow seemed to move just slightly when I wasn't looking. Every sound felt amplified in my ears. I was aware of my breathing, the echo of my footsteps, the distant rumble of a subway train far below me. Fear had settled in my stomach like a stone. After what felt like an hour, I spotted a 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickered, buzzing and humming. Relief hit me like a wave. I rushed inside, feeling the warmth hit my skin and the smell of frying food and coffee. The place was quiet, the few patrons staring at me like I had been wandering for days. I sank into a booth, still shaking, and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, anything to ground myself. I didn't speak to anyone, didn't explain myself, just focused on the warmth of the cup in my hands. While sitting there, I tried to piece together what had just happened. I replayed the coffee shop, the walk, the subway. Every detail came back, the way he laughed too loudly, the way his eyes had scanned the platform, the whisper that had left me frozen. It didn't make sense. Why me? Why that train? There were no signs, no obvious reason for his warning. Just a man, insisting I leave the train alone, then disappearing. Eventually, I realized that the city had a rhythm that I could follow. I looked at the diner menu, saw the exit signs, noticed the street outside. I started retracing my steps, walking carefully, choosing streets that seemed familiar. I kept my phone close, now charging in a wall outlet, so that at least I could reach someone if needed. I stopped at intersections, checking street signs, forcing myself to breathe, to think logically. After several blocks, I recognized a familiar building, a coffee shop I passed every day. Relief surged through me, grounding me again. The fear was still there, tight and cold in my chest, but now it was manageable. I finally made it back to my apartment, keys shaking in my hands, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted, staring at the wall, still half expecting him to appear. But he didn't. The city continued outside, indifferent, alive with the hum of traffic and distant sirens. I learned something that night, about how quickly normal can turn into danger, about how aware you have to be, about trusting instincts even when everything seems safe. I didn't see him again. I don't know if he had been following someone else, or if I had been entirely random, but I know I survived because I stayed calm enough to think, to move, and to find familiar ground. I never went back to that coffee shop. I take the subway cautiously now, paying attention to the people around me, and always keeping my phone charged. The fear is still there, a shadow at the edge of my mind, but I control it now, instead of letting it control me. The city didn't stop and life didn't pause, and in the end, I realized that was what made it scary, and what also saved me. You survive by moving, by noticing, by keeping your wits about you. That night could have gone in any direction, but I made it back. That simple fact, that clarity, gave me a strange kind of peace. It was over. I was safe. I was home. I remember the elevator ride up to his apartment clearly. It was one of those old Los Angeles buildings with the flickering lights in the hallways and that faint, constant hum of the city leaking through the thin walls. The door to his unit was just slightly ajar when I arrived, and I could see the sharp line of bright light cutting into the dim hallway. He had invited me up under the pretense of showing me his art collection. I should have known better. But at the time, I didn't. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the smell. It hit me immediately, a clean, almost chemical scent that was so sharp it made the back of my throat itch. The apartment looked sterile, more like a showroom than a lived-in space. The floors were polished until they reflected the overhead lights like glass, and every surface was wiped spotless. There was no clutter, no personal touches, not even books or magazines. The only things in the room were mirrors, so many mirrors, and they were positioned at odd angles, leaning against walls or hanging where you wouldn't normally put them. I assumed it was part of his art collection, though the way they reflected the room made me feel like I was under scrutiny from every possible angle. At first, I laughed quietly to myself, telling myself I was overthinking it. The space was unnerving, sure, but it was just mirrors and cleaning chemicals. I followed him from room to room, pretending to be interested in whatever pieces of art he pointed out, though I couldn't really see them over my growing unease. He moved with a kind of precision that made me feel uncomfortable, like everything in that apartment was arranged for a reason I wasn't meant to understand. Then, in the living area, he asked me to stand still while he adjusted the mirrors. I froze. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I glanced around at the mirrors, their surfaces gleaming under the dim ceiling lights, and I realized that the reflections were not quite right. I watched myself move my hands, my arms, and my legs, but the reflection didn't follow perfectly. It tilted its head in a slightly different way, and when I blinked, I swear it didn't blink with me. My heart started hammering in my chest. I told myself it was just a trick of the angles. The mirrors were oddly positioned, refracting light in strange ways. That had to be it. I tried to focus on his movements, on the casual way he shifted one mirror to the side and another up on the wall. But I couldn't stop looking at the reflection. It was alive in a way I wasn't. I moved my hand slowly, and the reflection did something else entirely. It mimicked me, but it did it wrong, like a delayed actor trying to copy someone else's motion. It leaned slightly when I didn't, and its gaze seemed heavier than mine could be. I realized then that I couldn't breathe right. The air felt thick, sticky, as if the apartment itself were watching me, waiting for me to do something wrong. I could feel the sterile smell of the cleaning chemicals in my lungs, making my chest tight, making my head spin. I told myself to calm down, that this was ridiculous, that I was imagining it. I even closed my eyes for a second and opened them again. The reflection was still wrong. It wasn't me. I tried to step back, but I noticed the way the mirrors surrounded me in every direction, catching every possible angle. There was no place to escape without moving toward him, toward the center of the room where the mirrors seemed to focus. My body moved slowly, as if the apartment itself were resisting me, my feet heavy against the shiny floor. I started scanning the apartment for something, anything, that could explain it. No cameras, no lenses, nothing I could see. Just mirrors, perfectly clean, perfectly still, except for the one reflecting me. I looked at it again and saw the faintest twitch in the corner of its mouth. My stomach dropped. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't mine. My hands were still at my sides, fingers relaxed. My reflection's fingers twitched. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught. The apartment felt claustrophobic. The bright white of the walls, the sterile shine of the floors, the cold reflection of the light all combined to make it feel like the space was stretching and closing at the same time. I could hear my own heartbeat like a hammer in my ears. I don't remember exactly when I realized I needed to get out. It wasn't sudden, it was creeping, a slow awareness that this was a trap I had walked into without knowing it. I tried to move toward the door, but the mirrors shifted subtly in my periphery, and I caught myself staring too long. The reflection moved in the way it shouldn't, tilting its head again, staring into me without blinking. I stepped backward. The sound of my own shoes on the polished floor echoed sharply, like a warning. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted. He didn't say anything during this time. He just moved the mirrors quietly, deliberately, as if he were performing some kind of experiment. His hands were precise, careful. There was no expression on his face, no smile, no frown, just calm, deliberate motion. I realized with a sinking feeling that the mirrors weren't showing a reflection. They were showing something else. Something that had been placed there intentionally, to trap my perception, to make me doubt myself. I could feel the sweat running down my back, slipping beneath my shirt. I could feel my throat closing up, and I wanted to fight, but fear made my body stiff. And then I saw it, the mirror at the far end of the apartment. It wasn't reflecting the ceiling or the floor. It was positioned to show only me, or what should have been me. And the thing in the reflection, whatever it was, smiled. Not a small smile, but a deliberate, knowing curve of the lips that I didn't make. I stumbled backward, barely noticing the sharp corner of a table as I did. Pain flared in my hip, but I didn't care. I wanted out. I wanted the hallway, the elevator, the faint hum of Los Angeles outside, anything but here. I realized the entire apartment was designed to isolate me, to make me focus on that wrong reflection until I couldn't tell reality from what the mirrors were showing. I backed toward the door, my movements shaky, my head darting between every mirror. The reflection followed, always wrong, always slightly delayed or altered. I felt a panic I've never felt before. My hands were shaking, my legs weak. I reached the door, twisted the knob, and it wouldn't budge. My breath came in short gasps. I tried again, harder, but the door remained locked. The sense of claustrophobia, of being manipulated, of the apartment itself being against me, intensified until it felt unbearable. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the quiet hum of the air vent, the soft scrape of a mirror being nudged somewhere behind me, the faint drip of water from the bathroom. Everything amplified. And then I remembered the window. I had been in the corner, near a small balcony door, mostly hidden behind a series of mirrors. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I shoved at the nearest mirror, felt the metal frame shift slightly under my hand, and in that instant I dove toward the glass, smashing it with my shoulder. It cracked sharply, jagged lines spiderwebbing across the surface. My fingers cut on the shards, but I ignored it. I shoved through, rolling onto the fire escape outside. The city noise rushed into my ears, cars honking, a distant siren, the usual chaos of Los Angeles at night. The chemical smell of the apartment was replaced by the cool night air, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe. I stayed there, lying on the metal fire escape, shivering, looking back up at the apartment. The lights inside were on, but the mirrors didn't reflect me anymore. They reflected the empty room, sterile and silent. I didn't know if he had been watching me, if he had set it all up in advance, or if it had been some kind of sick, obsessive experiment. I didn't want to know. I couldn't stay, couldn't think about it, couldn't try to rationalize it. I climbed down the fire escape slowly, cutting my hands on the rough metal, and when I hit the street, I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest busier avenue. The city felt alive, real, and the lights from the street lamps made me feel human again. Even now, I can't look at mirrors the same way. I know what I saw wasn't a ghost or some kind of fantasy. It was something that made sense in that apartment, and only there. The thought still makes my stomach turn, but I survived, and more than that, I remember every detail, the smell, the angles, the way the reflection moved wrong, the way the silence pressed against me like a weight. I don't know what his intention was, and I never want to find out, but the city is still here, real and noisy, and that night is behind me. I don't need to imagine it anymore. The apartment is just an apartment. The street lights are just street lights, and I am still me. I walked home slowly, keeping to well-lit streets, feeling the concrete under my feet, the cool air on my face. I made a point to avoid any building with mirrors lining the walls. Every shadow now holds a warning in my mind, every reflection a reminder. But I made it out, and that, in the end, is enough. I never should have agreed to meet him at the dog park. At first, I thought it was just another weird suggestion from someone I barely knew, someone I had only exchanged a few messages with over the past week. He had been persistent but charming in a way that made me keep answering, even though I felt a gnawing sense of doubt every time my phone buzzed with a new message from him. When he suggested the dog park, I laughed out loud. I don't even have a dog. I hadn't thought of the place as a real meeting spot, just a quiet, open space where people lingered in the late afternoon, letting their dogs run off leash. I told myself it was fine. It was only 5:45 p.m., the sky turning a dull, heavy gray with streaks of pink at the horizon. The light had that awkward in-between quality, neither bright nor fully dark, the kind of light that makes shadows stretch and twitch in ways that almost feel alive. I arrived early, mostly because my gut had been on edge for days. I walked past the gate, noticing the familiar smells, wet grass, damp dirt, the tang of dog fur mixed with whatever someone had left behind in the trash cans near the benches. I had walked this park a dozen times before, always alone, always noticing the same squirrels that darted from tree to tree, and the same patches of mud near the fence. It was a small park, divided into sections for small and large dogs, with benches spaced around the perimeter. Even with people around, there was always a quiet, almost empty feeling by the late afternoon. I chose a bench near the corner, the one I usually sat on when I came here. I watched the squirrels, tossing them a few pieces of leftover bread I always carried for them. I was so focused on the small, scuttling creatures that I almost didn't notice him standing behind the fence. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, someone walking through the park, but then he raised a hand in a casual wave. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. Just that wave. I froze. There was something wrong about him being there, standing at the edge of the fenced area, as if he had always been meant to be there, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that he just happened to be in the same place at the same time. But then he stepped closer, moving along the fence like he had been watching my movements for a while. He didn't enter the park, didn't call out to me. He just moved quietly, his eyes fixed on me, and my stomach dropped in a way that told me my instincts were right. I texted my friend a quick, frantic message. "I feel weird, come find me?" I didn't even need a response. I just needed the sense that someone else knew where I was. But before my phone could even vibrate, he leaned over the fence. He didn't shout. He didn't ask me to meet him. He whispered, just enough that I could hear it. "They can't help you here." The words sank into my chest like cold metal. I don't know why, but I didn't look around. I didn't run at first. My legs felt like lead. My mind raced in ways that didn't make sense. Was this person dangerous? Did he have a weapon? Why would he know my schedule, know which bench I usually sat on, know about the squirrels I fed? And then I ran. I don't even remember thinking about the gate, just that I needed to get away from him, away from the voice, away from the impossible sense that he had been there, always just waiting. I ran past the benches, past the swings in the small children's area, my sneakers crunching on the gravel path. I threw my phone in my bag, not wanting to be slowed down. My legs pumped like never before, my chest burning, and I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. When I finally reached my car, parked near the edge of the park, I stopped, bending over to catch my breath. My hands trembled as I pulled the keys from my pocket. Then I saw it. The paw prints. Wet, muddy, the size of a large dog, leading straight from the area I had been sitting all the way to the fence where he had stood. I stared at them, confused, heart hammering. My sneakers were clean. I had stepped in nothing. Yet the tracks were clear. They were real. They were there, leading from the corner of the bench to the fence, following the exact path I had just run. I couldn't think. My first thought was to call the police, but my hands shook too badly to hold the phone steady. I looked around. The park was almost empty now, a few stragglers walking their dogs on the far side, giving me curious glances, but no one could have seen what had just happened. No one could have been there to leave those prints except him. Except, something about those prints made me doubt reason. I sat in the car, locked the doors, and tried to steady my breathing. I kept glancing at the fence, half expecting him to be there again, but it was empty. Just the gray evening sky and the smell of wet grass. I debated leaving immediately, driving somewhere crowded, somewhere bright. My hands shook as I started the car. The engine roared, louder than I expected, and the noise made me jump. I reversed slowly, eyes darting to every corner of the park. There was no sign of him. Nothing except the mud, the prints, and the gnawing fear in my chest. I drove without looking at my phone, without thinking much about the route, just heading home in a blur. Every stoplight felt too long. Every shadow along the road made me tense. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring straight ahead, the key still in my hand. My heart finally started to slow, and I realized that I needed to do something. I couldn't just stay inside, paralyzed by fear. I called the police, explaining everything. My voice was tight, shaking, and I left out the part about the paw prints, because it sounded insane even to me. The officers arrived quickly. They asked questions, wrote notes, and eventually assured me they would patrol the area. One officer even mentioned that they would check for anyone lurking near the dog park around the same time the following days. I felt some relief, but it was fragile, like thin glass over a dark pit. Over the next few weeks, I avoided the dog park entirely. I walked different routes, kept my eyes on the street constantly, and slept with the lights on. But the memory of the paw prints, of his voice, of the knowing stare lingered. And then one evening, I realized something important. It wasn't magic. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't even meant to be supernatural. He knew the park. He had studied it. He had known exactly when I would be there, and he had used that knowledge to make me panic, to make me run, to make me feel alone. Those paw prints, somehow, whether by manipulation, misdirection, or a cruel trick, were meant to scare me. And it worked. I began to take control. I started varying my routines, avoiding predictable patterns, learning to be aware of my surroundings without letting fear control me. I reported everything I could to the police, described him in detail, and even set up a few security cameras at the park entrance and along my usual walking routes. Over time, I stopped feeling hunted. I began to feel prepared. The fear didn't vanish, but it became something I could manage. Months later, I returned to the dog park, not at the same time, not at the same bench, but I went. I walked slowly, deliberately, watching every corner, every shadow. The park smelled the same, looked the same, but now I was the one watching. I never saw him again, never found him, but the paw prints stayed with me, not as a threat, but as a lesson. He had wanted me to feel powerless, and for a moment I did. But I survived, and I learned that fear loses its grip when you refuse to let it. I had been stalked. I had been scared. But I had also fought back, even if it was just in small, quiet ways. And finally, after months of careful vigilance, I felt a strange sense of peace. I could return to the park, walk the same paths I had once avoided, and watch the squirrels as I always had. This time, the shadows didn't reach for me. This time, I was in control. I remember the weekend like it was yesterday, even though I've tried to bury the memory as deeply as I could. We had rented a small cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a weekend escape from everything. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of pine, and the fading light from the sunset made the cabin look warm and inviting from the outside. Inside, it was quiet except for the creaking of the wooden floors and the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks in the window frames. I felt safe enough, or so I thought. We spent the day hiking, taking pictures of the mist settling over the mountains, laughing at small things, and carrying bags heavier than we should have up the trails. By the time we got back, the sky had turned dark, a deep blue fading into black, and the only light came from the lamps we had brought in. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, dust, and that clean pine scent you only find in the mountains. We unpacked slowly, lingering in the warmth of the small kitchen, drinking cheap coffee from the coffee maker, and listening to the sound of branches scraping against the cabin walls. It was around 8:30 p.m. when he suggested we play a game. I laughed at first. Hide and seek, he said, was something he used to play as a kid, and he seemed excited. I didn't think much of it, just the kind of harmless silliness couples sometimes get into on trips. I agreed. The rules were simple. One of us would count, the other would hide. I went first to hide, thinking about corners, closets, under tables. I chose a small room off the kitchen, the kind that looked like it had been used for storage. The door was old, the lock a simple latch. I closed it behind me, barely breathing, and tried to listen. He would be counting, I reminded myself, just counting. But then I realized something was wrong. The door wouldn't open. I tugged, twisted, shook it. Nothing. My stomach tightened. I leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the wood, trying to calm down, telling myself maybe the latch was just stiff. Maybe I was overreacting. Then I heard him. His footsteps were moving around the cabin. I could hear them through the thin walls, slow and deliberate. He was counting, yes, but there was something off. The sound wasn't moving as I expected. It was always behind me. Whenever I thought he had gone to the left side of the cabin, the soft tap of his boots or the faint scratch of his shoes on the floor was suddenly behind me again, almost like he had moved faster than humanly possible. Panic started to rise. I banged on the door. I screamed. I shouted his name, hoping it was still a joke, hoping that any second he would burst in laughing. But the only response was a low, almost soft voice that seemed to come from the fireplace across the room from me. I couldn't see him, of course, but his voice felt wrong. Calm, too calm, and eerily confident. "You should know," he said. "You're always on my side." I froze. The words didn't make sense. I had no idea what he meant, but the sound of his voice made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I tried the door again. Locked. The latch was solid now, like it had never been meant to open from inside. My hands were shaking, the small lamp I had left in the corner casting weak shadows on the walls that seemed to move as I panicked. I started looking for another way out. There was a small window, too high to reach, the glass thick and frosted. I stacked a chair on top of a table and tried to push myself toward it. My fingers scraped the frame, and for a moment, I thought I might make it. Then I heard him again, the sound of shoes dragging lightly across the floor, slow, careful, following me. My mind raced. This was no longer a game. Every instinct screamed at me that I needed to get out. I looked around the room for anything to break the door, a chair, a heavy lamp, a fire extinguisher maybe. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture, and nothing heavy enough to break through the wood quickly. I started screaming again, hoping someone outside could hear me. Time became disjointed. Every movement I made, every sound I heard seemed to echo differently than it should. He was moving, I knew it, but the timing made no sense. It felt like he was everywhere, behind me, beside me, and yet nowhere at all. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I remembered the fireplace. The voice had come from there. I crept closer, hands trembling, trying to see anything unusual. The hearth was cold, no fire burning, just ashes from the night before. And then I noticed something subtle. A shadow, or maybe a trick of the light, at the edge of the fireplace. A small door, almost hidden by the bricks, a panel I had never seen before. My pulse raced. I fumbled with it, pushing, pulling, and finally, after what felt like eternity, it gave way. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow crawl space, dark and musty, but it was an escape route. Relief washed over me in a wave, sharp and intense. I didn't stop to think. I climbed in, scraping against the rough wood, dirt and dust filling my nose. The space twisted downward, small and confining, but at least it was a way out. I kept moving, following the faint light coming from the far end. Every sound behind me made me jump, but nothing followed. I reached the end of the crawl space and found a small trap door that led to the outside of the cabin, into the darkness of the surrounding trees. I pushed it open carefully, slipped out, and dropped into the underbrush, cold needles of pine scratching my arms and legs. I ran. I ran through the thick woods, branches hitting my face, roots tripping me, my lungs burning. Behind me, the cabin was quiet, but I didn't dare look back. I kept running until the trees thinned and I saw the road, faint but visible in the moonlight. I didn't stop there either. I flagged down a car, a stranger who looked shocked but didn't question me. I told them just enough to get to the nearest town, to call the police. When they arrived at the cabin, it was empty. No one was there, no signs of struggle, no indication of why the door had locked or why the panel had been there. I never got a clear answer. He was gone, vanished into thin air. But I learned something crucial that night. I learned that fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters or magic to exist. It lives in human actions, in the way someone you trust can turn a simple game into something dangerous. I stayed in town for a few days afterward, sleeping in a motel, avoiding the forest, avoiding anyone who reminded me of that weekend. Slowly, I started to feel safe again, but a part of me will always remember the sound of the footsteps behind the walls, the way the words from the fireplace felt like they had scraped into my brain, the suffocating panic of being trapped in that small room. I don't go back to the Smoky Mountains. I don't talk about what happened much, except to warn people. Locks can fail, doors can hide panels, and people can be frightening in ways that have nothing to do with ghosts or legends. It's not stories that haunt you. It's real moments when your trust is misplaced, when reality twists just enough to make you question everything around you. And I know now when someone says, "You're always on my side," it isn't always comfort. Sometimes, it's a warning you don't see coming until it's too late. That night, I survived because I found the hidden escape, because I didn't freeze completely, because I kept moving even when terror wrapped itself around me. And that's the only reason I am here, telling this story, able to remember, able to warn, able to breathe again. Even now, I can close my eyes and see that small room, the locked door, the shadow of the fireplace, and the faint, cold certainty of his words. And I know I survived, and I know I will never forget. The cabin still exists. The forest still waits. But I walk past it every time I'm near, never looking back. Some lessons are learned the hard way, and some fears stay with you forever. I learned both that night. I remember the day clearly, even though my memory of it still feels unreal. It was late afternoon, around 6:20, and we were in Shibuya, standing on the rooftop of a small cafe I had never noticed before, tucked above one of the narrow streets between the endless blocks of glass buildings. The cafe itself was quiet, almost too quiet for the city below. The tables were simple, metal and wood, and there were a few potted plants along the edges, mostly small shrubs and some overgrown ivy that clung to the railings. The air was warm but not oppressive, a typical January evening that felt like the city was holding its breath. At first, I was distracted by the view. Tokyo looked breathtaking from up there. The streets below were a maze of neon signs, cars, and people, moving in patterns I couldn't fully follow. The light of the sunset reflected off the glass facades of the tall buildings, turning the city into a field of gold and silver sparks. Everything looked alive and vibrant. I took out my phone to try to capture it, but the camera never really caught the depth of the scene. Even the pictures looked flat, almost dull compared to what my eyes could see. He stood beside me, leaning against the railing, hands folded casually. I didn't notice him at first. His face had that easy calm, the kind that made people trust him without realizing why. But then I noticed the way his eyes were fixed not on the city but on me. There was something in that gaze that unsettled me, something sharp and certain, as though he knew something I didn't. I blinked and focused on the streets below again, expecting to lose the feeling, to see the city as normal. But the people, they were moving differently. At first, it was subtle. A man crossing the street would pause slightly longer than necessary before stepping down from the curb. A group of women waiting for the train at the station moved in small, staggered patterns, as if each of their steps were carefully measured to match the others. I brushed it off. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe just the way I was noticing movement, because I was nervous being up here with him. Then it became harder to ignore. Every person on the streets below seemed to move in unison. The commuters on the sidewalks, the tourists with cameras, even the delivery workers on scooters, they all twisted their heads and glanced toward the cafe, just slightly at first, almost like a reflex. And then, as if triggered by some invisible signal, their eyes all fixed upward at the exact same time. I froze. The sudden synchrony was terrifying. I looked at him, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Something colder. Something knowing. The kind of smile that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I wanted to take a photo, something to prove what I was seeing, but my phone camera showed nothing unusual. Just the normal city. I panned slowly, hoping I had imagined it, but every shot was ordinary. The cars moved like cars, the people moved like people. But when I looked up from the screen, they were all staring again, frozen in the exact same pose, all their heads turned perfectly toward us. My stomach twisted. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of perspective. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was anxious. I pinched my arm, hard, and it hurt. I wasn't dreaming, but my logical mind kept trying to reason it away. Tokyo is huge, people are busy, and sometimes the brain finds patterns where none exist. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But then he said something quietly, without moving his lips much. Just enough that I could catch it. I think they can see you now too. The words didn't make sense, not in any literal way. Yet somehow they explained everything. Or maybe they made the fear worse, giving it a shape and a name. I could feel it in my chest, that strange, deep pressure that makes breathing heavy and slow. I didn't understand what he meant, couldn't begin to grasp it, but I knew the city had shifted. Everything I thought I knew about normal life, about ordinary people, was suddenly wrong. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run down the stairs, out into the streets, and lose myself in the crowds. But the movement of the people below had changed. They weren't just frozen anymore. They were waiting, not in a way that made sense. They didn't move, but somehow the presence of them watching was physical, pressing against the air, a weight I could feel on my skin. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I realized then that my instincts were failing me. My eyes kept flicking to the edges of the crowd, looking for anyone who was acting naturally, anyone who wasn't part of the unison. But there was no one. The vendors on the corner, the small families crossing the street, the people in cafes and shops below, all of them were part of it. Even when cars drove past, the drivers didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't breathe as far as I could tell. They moved like machines with human shapes. He laughed softly, almost inaudibly, and I could feel it in my chest. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't shocked. He just existed in that moment differently than I did. I wanted to ask him what was happening, what he meant, but I couldn't find my voice. I couldn't even force my throat to move. My body felt disconnected from my thoughts, as if I was observing myself from a distance. Minutes passed. The light was fading, and the shadows were growing longer across the city. The neon signs started to glow brighter, and the streets below took on a reddish-golden haze. I noticed something subtle then. Despite the unison, no one below seemed to notice the changing light. They didn't shift, didn't blink more often, didn't even adjust their posture. They just waited. Finally, I realized I had to do something. Standing frozen on that rooftop, staring down at a city that no longer seemed real, would destroy me. I couldn't stay there, even with him. I turned to him, ready to run, to push past him, to climb over the railing if I had to. But he simply stepped aside and nodded toward the stairwell. Not in a threatening way, not in a guiding way, just acknowledging that the path was there. I descended the narrow metal stairs as quickly as I could, my hand tight on the railing, legs shaking. Each floor I passed, I glanced out the windows, and the streets looked normal again. Commuters walked at their own pace, taxis honked, people laughed. Everything returned to the chaotic rhythm I recognized as ordinary life. The weight lifted slightly, as if whatever had been holding the city in that strange, synchronized pause was gone once I left the rooftop. When I reached the street level, the sounds of the city felt almost deafening after the silence and stillness above. I breathed deeply, inhaling the smell of gasoline, grilled food, and the faint tang of winter air. I turned around, half expecting to see the cafe looming above me, empty, normal. It was still there, but no one was on the rooftop. Not him, not the staff, not anyone. It was just a small cafe, tucked above the busy street, exactly like it had looked in the past, ordinary and unassuming. I walked away slowly, keeping my eyes on the ground, trying not to look up. I didn't know if I had imagined the people moving in unison, the way they had watched us. I didn't know if he had been real, or if the whole experience was some kind of hallucination. But I knew one thing: I wasn't afraid anymore. Not because I had figured it out, but because I understood something that I hadn't before. The city is bigger than any one of us, bigger than fear, bigger than confusion. It can feel overwhelming, unnatural, and even terrifying, but it keeps moving, keeps existing. Even when something seems to watch, even when everything seems aligned against you, life below continues. People will breathe, cars will move, the lights will change. And somewhere in that mass, in the chaos and noise, you find your path again. I never went back to that cafe. I don't even know if it exists the same way anymore. But I walk through Shibuya every day, among the millions of people, and I feel a little lighter. I remember the fear, yes, the unnatural stillness, the perfect synchronized gaze. But I also remember how the city continued, how it moved again, how I found my way back into the flow. And that thought, simple, ordinary, unremarkable, is enough. It reminds me that even when the world seems strange or too big to handle, you can move forward. You can breathe again. You can be a part of the rhythm, even when it feels impossible. And that, in the end, is what matters. I was sitting at a small coffee shop near Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon, on a gray, overcast morning. The kind of morning where the clouds hang low and the streets feel heavy with damp air, and you can smell the faint mixture of rain and roasted coffee beans as soon as you step outside. I had just ordered a cappuccino and was sitting across from a friend, laughing about something trivial. One of those conversations that doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things but feels important in the moment. The shop was small, cozy, with wooden tables that had been worn smooth by years of hands resting on them. Steam rose in delicate curls from our mugs, mixing with the faint smell of pastries and the sharp tang of espresso. I was halfway through a story when something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. There was a man in a black hoodie, sitting alone, staring in our direction. At first, I didn't think much of it. Portland is full of people who look a little lost, who seem to hang around coffee shops with nowhere else to go. I turned back to my friend and tried to ignore it, but the feeling didn't leave me. Every time I glanced up, he was still there, just watching, his head tilted slightly, as if he were trying to catch every word we said. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just bored. Maybe he was people watching like the rest of the city. I even laughed nervously and tried to make a joke about it, but it didn't sit right. We finished our drinks and decided to leave. As I stood up and collected my bag, I noticed him move. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing near the door casually, as if he had been waiting for the right moment. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe he was leaving too. I stepped outside, and the damp chill hit me immediately. The city smelled of wet asphalt and faint smoke from distant chimneys. That's when I saw him outside. He wasn't just nearby. He was pacing in front of the shop, slow, deliberate steps. He wasn't walking like someone heading somewhere. He was just moving, always keeping the shop between us, watching. I told my friend we should go, and we started walking down the street, trying to blend in with other pedestrians. But every few steps, I would look over my shoulder. And every time I did, he was closer. Not just a little closer, but noticeably closer. My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Portland streets at 11:30 in the morning are usually full of tourists, students, people with errands, and here I was, with someone who clearly wasn't part of that crowd following us. I quickened my pace, my friend doing the same, but even as I forced myself to walk faster, I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and urgent. Then I noticed another figure. At first, I thought it was just another passerby, a person moving naturally along the sidewalk. But the way they kept appearing in my line of sight, every time I slowed or paused, made me realize it wasn't random. This person emerged from the alley beside the shop, moving quickly but silently, keeping pace with us from behind. My chest tightened. I didn't speak. My friend didn't either. We both knew we were being followed, and talking would only draw attention to ourselves. I could feel my hands shaking slightly in my coat pockets. My mind raced with questions. Why are they following us? Do they know us? Are they dangerous? Every rational thought was being drowned by a rising tide of fear I hadn't felt in years. I turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose them, hoping that maybe they were just heading in the same general direction. But the black hoodie was still there, and the second person, moving like a shadow, was still behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I started to run, the soles of my shoes splashing in the wet pavement, my bag bouncing against my hip. I didn't know where I was going exactly, just that I had to get somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. I passed a small park, the playground empty, slides glistening with rain. I considered ducking in there, hiding behind the jungle gym, but the thought of them finding me in the open space made me shake my head and keep moving. I crossed streets, past coffee shops, bookstores, and a couple of late-arriving tourists who barely noticed me. The city felt different at that moment, heavier, quieter. Even though people were around, I felt completely alone, exposed. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. I glanced back again, and my stomach sank. They weren't running, they never ran, but they were still behind me. The man in the black hoodie was closer, always just a few steps behind, and the second person was coming out of shadows, silently, impossibly calm. It was like they were moving with the city, weaving through pedestrians and traffic without anyone noticing, but always keeping me in their sights. I finally saw a police station up ahead. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I sprinted across the street, ignoring the honking cars and startled pedestrians, and burst through the front doors. The lobby smelled like linoleum and coffee from the small vending machine in the corner. A few officers looked up from their desks, surprised. I was panting, my face flushed, hands shaking, trying to explain without sounding insane. I told them about the man in the black hoodie, about the second person who had emerged from the alley, about how I had been followed through several blocks. They listened, scribbling notes, asking me to describe the people. I realized that for the first time since I noticed them, I felt a flicker of safety. I was no longer alone in the open streets. There were people trained to deal with situations like this, people who could act if things escalated. The officers radioed outside while I waited. I could hear their voices echoing through the small station, urgent but calm. Then one officer came back and told me that they had canvassed the area around the coffee shop and nearby streets. The man in the black hoodie had been seen pacing, yes, but there was no evidence he was dangerous beyond loitering, and the second person was gone, seemingly disappeared into the crowd. They suggested I go home or stay somewhere safe until the day passed. I thanked them, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The adrenaline was finally fading, leaving behind a tired ache in my body. I walked home slowly, sticking to main streets, making sure to stay near people, near traffic. The city seemed normal again, ordinary, full of everyday noises, the clatter of a streetcar, the hum of pedestrians, the distant murmur of conversation. But the memory of those two shadows stayed with me. I realized later that the encounter wasn't about anything supernatural or mysterious. It was about danger lurking quietly in normal places, about strangers who could observe and follow without raising alarm. And that realization, the stark awareness of how easily someone could track you through the streets, stayed with me long after I got home. I double-locked my door, checked the locks on my windows, and even though nothing ever happened again, I carried that morning with me. A reminder that caution and awareness matter, even in familiar, crowded places. It was a terrifying experience, but I had made it out without harm because I acted quickly, stayed calm under pressure, and got to a safe, public place. That day taught me to trust my instincts, to notice the small details that something might be off, and to value the presence of people who could help. In the end, I wasn't physically hurt, but I came away with a lasting understanding of the quiet threats that exist in everyday life, and a sense of vigilance I still carry every time I walk through the city streets alone. I realized then that survival isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about noticing, moving carefully, and making your way to safety. That morning, the black hoodie and the shadow in the alley didn't catch me. I made it home. I locked my door, and I finally exhaled. That was the moment I felt in control again. The moment I knew I had survived something that could have been much worse, and I never took the safety of normal, ordinary streets for granted again. I remember the night clearly, even though I've tried to forget it. It started like any other Thursday, late at night, around 11. I had just finished my shift and was tired in that deep, bone-weary way that makes your limbs heavy and your head foggy. I stopped at a gas station on the edge of the city to grab a drink and a snack. The fluorescent lights made the whole place feel too bright, too awake for how late it was, and the smell of gasoline mixed with fried food hung thick in the air. He was already there when I pulled up, leaning against his car like he had been waiting. He smiled when he saw me, like we had planned this, though we hadn't. He talked fast, full of energy, telling me about some secret place with a perfect view of the city lights. It didn't sound dangerous at first. In fact, it sounded kind of romantic, the way people talk about little adventures they've been meaning to take. The air felt cool and sharp, the kind of chill that makes your skin tingle when you step out of a warm car. I hesitated, but there was something in the way he looked at me, patient and insistent, that made me say yes. We got into his car. It was an old sedan, nothing fancy, a little scratched up but clean inside. The smell of leather cleaner and air freshener hit me immediately. He started driving, and at first it was normal. We passed empty streets, the occasional streetlight casting long shadows on the asphalt, the city behind us glowing faintly through the trees. Then he turned onto a winding road I didn't recognize. The houses disappeared, replaced by thick woods and the occasional chain-link fence. The road got narrower and steeper, twisting sharply around corners. I noticed he hadn't turned on the car's interior lights. I asked him where exactly we were going, and he just smiled. I pressed a little more, trying to get a hint, and then, without warning, he switched off all the lights. The headlights, the interior lights, everything. The world outside the car disappeared into black, so deep it felt like we were floating in nothing. My heart started to pound. I tried to open the door, thinking I could just get out and walk back to the city, but it was locked. I tried again, harder this time. Locked. I couldn't even roll down the windows. He was calm, too calm, and that terrified me more than anything. We kept going. The road twisted, dipped, and climbed. I tried my phone, GPS, maps, anything. No signal. Nothing. The radio only played static, the kind of high-pitched scratch that makes your teeth ache. I realized that even if I wanted to, I couldn't call for help. I didn't even know where here was. I asked him how to get back, and he didn't seem to have a plan. He didn't panic. He just kept driving, slow and steady, like he had done this before or like it was nothing unusual to be lost on some dark, empty road in the middle of nowhere. I felt trapped in a nightmare that wasn't supposed to exist in real life. Time slowed. Each curve of the road seemed longer than the last. I could feel my pulse in my throat, hear it in my ears. The darkness outside pressed in on the car. I could see his hands on the wheel, the way they didn't shake. I could see his face in the faint reflection of the dashboard, calm and almost smiling. I started imagining all the worst possibilities. I tried reasoning with myself, telling myself maybe he just didn't know the way back, maybe he thought this was funny, maybe he was scared too. But none of that made me feel any better. We stopped once at what I thought was a small clearing. He got out for a second, but it was too dark to see much beyond the hood of the car. I stayed inside, my hands gripping the seat. I could hear the wind through the trees, distant and hollow, and the car engine ticking as it cooled. When he got back in, he started driving again. The road seemed endless. Every time I thought we must be close to something, the road twisted again, another hill, another turn, another dark stretch. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about breaking the window, but the car was old and solid, not like a cheap rental. I tried opening the door again, and again nothing. I even tried kicking the door, and it barely budged. I realized I was completely trapped. My chest tightened, and panic started rising. But I forced myself to breathe, one shallow breath at a time. I told myself I had to stay calm, or I'd make a mistake. Hours, or maybe it was minutes, time felt warped. I stopped trying to force the doors. Instead, I watched the road, trying to memorize every twist and turn, trying to figure out a pattern or a landmark. The air in the car was thick, smelling faintly of his cologne and the faint metal of the dashboard. My throat was dry, my hands sweating against the leather. I felt like the world had ended outside those windows, that we were in a small metal bubble floating in total darkness. And then, as suddenly as the darkness had started, I saw the first glimpse of light. Faint, yellow, artificial, like a streetlight. Relief hit me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. He slowed, and I saw signs, road markings, the way the asphalt changed to a familiar texture. We were back on a road I recognized, one I had driven many times. The city lights appeared again, faint at first, and then brighter as we came closer. My body relaxed in a way I hadn't known was possible in hours, even though it was only minutes. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched, trying to absorb that the world outside the car still existed, that normal life was still happening somewhere beyond this terrifying bubble. He didn't seem like he had been affected at all by the experience, calm as ever, like none of it had mattered. The traffic lights, the buildings, the occasional late-night car, all of it felt like proof that we had never really been lost. But I knew better. I had felt the fear of being completely powerless, trapped, and alone in a stranger's car in the middle of nowhere. Finally, we reached a main road, the kind with cars passing and lights on almost every corner. I told him I needed to go home. He didn't argue. I left the car at the nearest intersection, walking carefully to the nearest gas station with lights still on. I felt shaky, like my body had been shaking for hours, and I couldn't stop replaying the winding road, the dark, the silence. When I finally got back home, I locked the door behind me and just sat on the floor, trying to convince myself I was safe. In the days afterward, I thought about calling the police, about reporting him, but I didn't have proof of anything. It could have been a terrible mistake, a thrill gone wrong. But I knew the truth. I had felt real fear, and I had been completely at his mercy. I learned to trust my instincts more after that night, to not get into cars with strangers, even people I thought I knew, and to never ignore the voice in my head telling me something isn't right. It still comes back to me sometimes late at night. I think about the way the car just wouldn't stop, the way he stayed calm, and how powerless I felt. But I also remember the relief when the city lights returned, the first sign that I was safe again. It taught me that fear is real, but so is survival. That night could have ended in a nightmare, but it didn't. I survived because I stayed alert, because I held on to my own sense of awareness, even when the world inside that car seemed completely gone. I'll never forget it, and I never will. It took me a long time to feel okay driving at night again, to feel comfortable getting into a car with someone else, but I did. I made sure I never let someone else have that much control over me again. The city lights became a symbol of safety after that night, a reminder that even when things feel completely out of control, there is a way back, a way to return to something real and steady. And that's exactly what I cling to, the knowledge that fear doesn't have to win, that even when the car won't stop, eventually, you can find your way home. The memory still makes my heart race, but it also makes me careful, aware, stronger. And sometimes, when I see winding roads in the dark, I remember that night and smile a little, because I survived.